Hey everyone, and welcome to our August live event with National Sewing Circle. Once again, we have Nicki LaFoille back to answer all your sewing questions. So thanks for being here, Nicki.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Of course. All right, so we're going to, if you're new and have never joined us for a live event, what's going to happen is that you can ask any sewing or maybe even some quilting questions because Nicki's branching out lately, and she'll answer them over the next hour. So of course we have on the screen, depending on where you're watching, a couple different chat boxes. So you want to make sure that you are putting it into the live chat box so we can see it right now. The other chat box goes to customer service, which we do still answer. You just won't get to see your answer live. So make sure you're using the right live chat box. And then those will come to us, and I will ask them to Nicki, and she will provide answers. We have a couple that have already come in that we'll get to in just a second, but I do want to tell you about something that you can download as well, and that should be in a banner either above or below the video you're watching now, and it is a PDF on ways that you can sharpen your tools. So Nicki and I will talk more about sharpening tools here in a little bit, but I do want to get to this first question here. Someone has asked, how do you sew layered dresses or skirts? Do you make a dress first and then add the layers?
So layers, there are a couple ways that my mind goes for that. So when a question like that comes in, layers, I feel like maybe that means lining. So we'll talk about lining for a second first. So when you want to line a dress or a skirt, it is like making two skirts or two dresses. You make the lining out of your lining fabric, but you use most of the same pattern pieces. Same thing with the skirt. You would make essentially a second skirt, just if this, depending on how it's closed, if you've got a waistband on your skirt, you wouldn't do a lining for that. You just do the lining for the main body pieces, and then hem them separately, and then you would attach them at the waistband, or if it's a dress, sometimes it's attached, depending on how much is lined, sometimes it's attached in the arm's eye, or usually the sleeves aren't really lined, but I've seen that in some cases as well. So yeah, it's essentially like making a second garment just out of your lining fabric, which is usually a little bit lighter weight. But if you are doing layers, so if you've got like layers of tulle to make a skirt or a dress kind of puffy, it would actually, it'd be kind of the same idea. You would cut your layers and kind of construct them. I guess it all depends on how it's all put together. It's kind of a hard question without getting into the exact specifics of it. But when I'm thinking layers, I'm thinking like layers of tulle. And sometimes that is attached like into the waistband of a skirt or dress, or sometimes you get your inner layer is straighter, and then you stitch the layers of tulle in like little tiers, kind of, to give yourself volume. So like in all things sewing, there are a lot of different avenues that will get you to the same destination. So
Yes.
different options.
So I'm glad that one of your last words there was tiers, because that's what I first visualized when layered skirts. So I'm thinking like a skirt that has, short, medium, long layers, but you don't necessarily want to feel like you're wearing three skirts. So
Right.
how would you construct that? And would you start like with the longest one, or you start with the shortest one and then just add to the bottoms of it?
Right. Yeah, I can see that, because if you're having like three layers, like three tiers, you don't necessarily want all of that bulk gathered into the waistband or the upper edge. So yeah, I would do like a main body skirt, but it would be so if it was like gathered layers, like gathered ruffles, you would want to do um, your main piece, which would be more like a pencil or an A line, because you don't want to have your gathered skirt and then you're not going to be able to stitch another layer onto that because it's going to have a lot of volume. So you need to start with something that is a little more fitted, and then stitch your layers onto that. So I would start with that narrow silhouette and then stitch probably, your maybe your shortest layer first, so that then you know where to attach the mid layer, so that that top layer covers where your mid layer attaches. And then same thing for your bottom one. You want, that middle layer to come, if it came down to here, then you would attach your lowest layer, up here, so that you get some coverage of that upper edge of the layer.
Yeah.
And then what is attached to your waistband would just be, you would attach that narrow silhouette underneath, and your upper layer would probably also be attached into your waistband.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. So I think we have it covered for layers, tiers, poof, or whatever it is you're looking for. Lining. There we go. We got everything covered in terms of skirts and dresses. All right, next question here. Dorothy asks, has anyone had any difficulty with changing a needle, particularly with a brother? Or is anyone familiar with brother sewing machines or had any issues with brother sewing machines? I know you and I both started out on brother machines, so.
We did, and I owned 2 different brother machines when I was starting out, and I never had really any problems changing the needles. If anyone watching has, feel free to chime in. But yeah, I didn't have any major issues with my brother machine. I had a CS 6000i, and then I don't remember the number of my other one, but it was like a step above that, I think. But it was a very simple machine, had very simple controls. So there wasn't a lot of, technology and machinery going on other than, the basic, sewing machine bobbin type thing. Or I didn't have a screen or anything. And I like that in a machine, sort of a simpler design, so that it's, less moving parts, less going on, just personally. But yeah, I didn't have any major issues. It did everything that I needed it to do. It was kind of lightweight because I chose a lower end model just for that time in my life. Um, so, and then I kind of graduated out of it when I wanted something heavier duty that had, more function and capabilities. So yeah, personally, I haven't had any issues with a brother.
Same here. I have my first one is the SQ 9050, so it was like a sewing quilting. I don't even think they make that model anymore, but still, like I said, same thing, very basic. Still a very very good machine. My son is 3, but that's the one he's going to learn on when he's a little bit older. But just like in terms of if you're having issues changing your needle, just a couple of basics. I know sometimes if I'm in a hurry, I don't unscrew it all the way. I unscrew it enough to where the existing needle drops out pretty easily, but go ahead and unscrew it a little more before you try to put that new needle back in, because if you don't get it up there, far enough or all the way, it's not going to work. And then make sure your needle's going in the right way. So needles they're not round, they're actually almost like this. And so you have to make sure that you're putting the flat edge where it needs to go. So any other needle changing tips you can think of?
Yeah, so yeah, the flat side of the needle goes toward the back, I believe in mine anyway. And yeah, when you're trying to get that new needle up far enough that it needs to go, definitely make sure your screw is loose enough. And also when I'm putting a new needle in and I'm trying to, shove it up there as far as it needs to go, my fingers will slip on it sometimes. So if you need to get something hard and flat underneath, the point of the needle to kind of push it up, to make sure it's getting up as far as it needs to go to tighten that screw down.
Yeah. I always try to just hook it with my fingernail and push it up. So if you're daring enough, try that. But if you have fake fingernails, which I used to have all the time, super easy, definitely recommend. But if you have short ones, maybe not, maybe something else. But all right, the next one here is going to be kind of like our first question in terms of skirts and layers. We're going to see where you take this question. But what material is good for scarves?
Okay. Yeah, very open-ended question. That's good because we can get the full array of scarves to talk about.
Exactly.
So for a lightweight scarf, I've made several of these, just like a um, fall, spring, even summertime scarf, depending on where you live. A nice lightweight. Um, I made my last one in a batiste fabric. So I got a batiste from, I want to say Cloud9 Fabrics. They have some really pretty prints in different, fabrics, different weaves and stuff. So batiste is just a really lightweight fabric. It's almost like a gauze. It's very thin, kind of flimsy. So, but it was actually not very difficult to sew with at all. It was still stable enough to do. I did a narrow rolled hem on the edge. Um, and I inserted like snap tape and some other fun stuff. But it's lightweight enough for me to wear, even when the weather starts getting warmer, when I want, coverage on my shoulders from the sun. I think I did that for a video for National Sewing Circle, actually. So that might be coming up shortly. I added like a little pocket on the inside. It was like a travel scarf with a zipper on the pocket. So that might be fun to check out. But also, if you want if you have a knit fabric, those are good for those types of like wraps, just like a lightweight jersey knit fabric. And then if you don't really even have to finish the edges if you don't want to, because a knit will not ravel. So that's a really easy thing. You can just kind of cut a rectangle and throw it around your neck. But I've made, circle scarves, and as long as the fabric is kind of the hand and the softness that you like against your skin, you can go into the store when the stores open back up. You can go in and, touch the fabric, feel the hand. But batiste is a good one. Lawn is a nice kind of tight weave cotton, but it's really soft and has a nice drape. I love rayon for a whole bunch of things. I love rayon garments, so that would even be a good one for scarves. So those are kind of some lightweight ones. But if you wanted to go a little heavier weight for like a warm scarf, you can go to materials that are a little bit more substantial. So even a quilting cotton is, you can make a circle scarf out of that, or even, I did when we were doing our little projects, Ashley, I did using fat quarters, I did a scarf with some snaps, and I bound the edges, and that was a really nice scarf that I still wear to this day. A little bit lighter weight, but heavier weight than like a batiste or a gauze. But you can even go, like a double knit. That's a little more of a substantial knit fabric. That would make a nice warm scarf. But yeah, some of those are some good options. And, if you wanted to do more of like a winter scarf, there's minky. You can do some fun things with, like, you can even add some layers inside if you wanted to do, like, there's faux fur. You can, add layers inside of it to make it, bulkier and warmer. Add some fringe on the ends if you want to just do like a long rectangle. So scarves are an excellent project for beginner sewers because it's mostly, straight lines and rectangles and easy shapes. So there's just a ton of fun things that you can do with scarves. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. So I'm gonna sum it up real quick. What material is good for scarves? Any. Like you can literally make any. But we have a bunch of, I mentioned you. I haven't seen the one that you just did, which means it's not out yet because I would have seen it first. And that was the one shoot of yours I missed. Gosh darn, taking time off to have a baby, right? But so I haven't seen it, so I know it's coming out soon. So be looking for that one. But some other ones we've done, again, yeah, the project we did where you and I both did fat quarter projects. We won't talk about my project because it was really bad, but your scarf was really, really cute. And then we have a couple other ones too. So Aurora, one of our other instructors, she has both a video and a written article pattern on how to do an infinity scarf. I believe she uses more of a stretchy knit fabric. We have several patterns where you mentioned quilter's cotton. I've done one that's half quilter's cotton, half lace. And so it's one you wrap twice. So depending on how you wrap it around, you have, different fanciness level, I guess you could say. We also have patterns where it is another version of a travel scarf, but it's a much heavier one. I think I use some flannel fabric. So not only can you use any fabrics that you want, but we have quite an array of patterns and videos and articles for you to choose from on National Sewing Circle as well. Our next question here, should I iron my fabric before I start sewing? I can't decide how important pressing before sewing is.
So this is probably kind of specific to what fabric you're using. So some fabrics will wrinkle up a lot easier than others. I have some fabric that I found in my grandma's sewing room that I don't even know what it is, but if I just look at it wrong, it'll wrinkle. And I'm constantly having to iron it before I cut anything out of it. And, when I washed it and it came out of the dryer, it was like this crinkly mess. And then you get it all pressed flat. And then sometimes those wrinkles will try to come back. So I'm finding I have to press it more often than some other fabrics. But the short answer to this, I guess, would be if there are wrinkles or creases in it that would affect the lines of your pattern, or whatever lines that you're trying to cut on the fabric, I would press those out and make sure it's as flat as you can get it before cutting your pieces out. Because if you've got, a crease or a tuck or a wrinkle, and you cut your fabric out of that, you're going to get a little. The pattern's just going to be a little bit off. So trying to make sure your fabric is as flat as it can be before cutting is always a good idea. And I use my steam on my iron whenever possible because it's just a good, quick, easy way to get things lying nice and flat.
Absolutely. I have to say, if I see a fabric, if I'm making a garment or something, and I see a fabric that wrinkles a lot, I am so going to avoid that fabric. Yeah. I don't want to have to deal with that every time you wash it. But that's perfect. All right, our next one here, Anne says, suggestions for sewing Velcro closures to decorative pillows.
So if you want a pillow cover that you can take off easily for washing and whatever, yeah, a Velcro closure is a good idea. I usually do envelope closures on my pillow shams just because, to avoid having to add anything extra. It's an easy way to, you tuck your pillow in the back and it, laps over and it's easy. But if you want to add a Velcro closure, you can do, I would say to do it probably, you could do it in one of the side seams. It might just affect the way that you might be able to feel it on the pillow if you're using the pillow. It might, make that seam like lay weird because sometimes, the pillow shams, depending on the type of pillow you have, if it's really squishy, you want those edge seams to be able to flow with the squish of the pillow. And if you've got Velcro in one of those side seams, it might make it a little stiffer and might make it, lay weird. So the safer bet would probably be to insert it in the back of the pillow somewhere. So you can create a seam in the back of the pillow. You'll probably want that seam to lap a bit still anyway, because if you make your seam in the back, lap just enough to get that Velcro on, it might gap unless you put the Velcro across the entire back of the pillow seam. You could do that. But if you wanted to just have, a small chunk of Velcro to close it, I would have that lap quite a bit and put your Velcro so you've got, some under so that if it gaps on either side of the Velcro, it's not going to, show the pillow form inside. So probably doing, maybe a long strip of Velcro across a back seam would be a good bet. But I would try to avoid sewing the Velcro into the side seam. So I would, add that Velcro in to the back seam, but, just inside of the side seams so that when you're stitching up the side seams, you're not stitching on the Velcro just because that also adds bulk and it's a pain. Yeah. So I could visualize that in my head. I hope that you could too.
So I have a harder time visualizing the side seam one, but absolutely the overlapping of the back makes total sense. And I mean, like I would normally do an envelope style too, but I guess if you'd normally want to overlap that by like 7 or 8 inches. And so it's like if you don't have enough fabric, then Velcro could be an alternative. But I try to avoid Velcro because I've never successfully sewn through it, and I've never had the sticky back successfully stay sticky. So it's like if I had to have a closure, I would rather do like really big, say 3 buttons across the back, and that way it's on the back, but you can also flip it around and now it's a decorative element on the front. So it's like not to say Velcro is not good for some things, but there might be a more fun alternative as well.
Right. And I've done pillows with like an invisible zipper,
Yeah.
like in the one of the side seams, because a zipper is a little more flexible than Velcro, so that can go in one of the, the bottom seams and not have it affect the feel and the look of your pillow too.
Yes. And so I'm not going to make you try and explain how to do an invisible zipper with hand movements, but Nicki did a tutorial for us on National Sewing Circle on how to insert an invisible zipper. So that's a great tutorial if you want to use that and put a zipper in the pillow. That'd be perfect. Our next question here, Brenda says she's new to sewing and has a question on how to choose fabric for clothing. I need help understanding what is meant when they give you suggested fabric choices like jersey, matte jersey, lightweight double knit, lightweight chalet, crepe, all those different kinds of fabrics, understanding what to look for when you go to the fabric store. You don't see those specific names on the fabrics when they sell them. So is there a guide somewhere or any direction you can give her in terms of selecting the correct fabric?
Yeah. So sometimes you'll see these fabric names and it's like, what even is that? And sometimes I'll even come across something, a fabric name that I just have to type into Google and see what that is. Because sometimes, they differentiate fabrics by fiber content.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they'll differentiate fabrics by weave. So like lawn is typically 100% cotton fabric. It's just lighter weight threads in a tighter weave. Poplin, I think a couple months ago, we figured out that poplin is a type of weave. So you can have cotton poplin, you can have silk poplin, whatever. Poplin is just you have an extra thread in one of the weaves. I don't remember if it was a warp or a weft thread, but you have an extra thread in the weave. So it makes a little bit of a thicker, tighter, more substantial weave. So, if you're in doubt as to what something is, I would say just do a quick Google search on that specific thing, because there are a whole bunch of different guides out there as to, different fabrics, but I'm sure not, I'm sure they're not exhaustive. I'm sure they don't have, every single different type of fabric on them. So, you might want to just use a keyword search, use the keyword of that specific fabric that you're trying to find information on, and you'll probably be able to find, a list describing, what it is, what differentiates, like what differentiates matte jersey from other type of jerseys or a double knit or whatever. So yeah, it's hard to point to one source, but yeah, I'd say do a search, because there are a lot of different things that can differentiate fabrics. Even the process used to make the fabric or to make the print on it, like a batik fabric can be a lot of different fiber contents or weaves. Batik, it means the process used to make the pattern, the wax resist dye is what makes a fabric a batik. So it can be confusing for sure. But yeah, I'd say do a keyword search to specifically find what you're looking for. Sorry, I can't be more specific
No,
than
I
that.
think that's great, and especially since the question came as a beginner question, just starting out, sticking to some of the more, I'm going to say, basic, easier to find fabrics. It's definitely going to be labeled cotton, jersey, knit. You'll have those basic labels on there, so you should still be able to get a good feel for the difference between, like I said, the most popular or the most readily available types of fabric.
Right. And yeah, at the fabric store, you're probably not going to see names like that, like Peak or a Chalet. Um, I've seen crepe at like a Joanne Fabrics. That's a little bit more
On this. In the special occasions aisle.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, special occasions aisle, you'll find some of those different fabrics too. But yeah, they'll always have the fiber content on the bolt. So you'll be able to see if it's, 90% cotton and 10% spandex or whatever. So that can help you identify how to treat it and help you figure out how it's going to react, how it's going to sew, how it's going to feel. So yeah, you'll have that information on the bolt anyway. But yeah, for a beginner, I would say try not to worry too much about all those different. You could dive down the rabbit hole and find a whole bunch of different complicated weaves and fiber contents and all that. But I'd say stick to basic, like 100% cotton, or your jersey knit fabric. That's a common and versatile type of knit. Double knit is just a little bit thicker, and a tighter, it's not quite as stretchy, doesn't have as much stretch to it. So yeah, just like cotton, you can do, um, even like a canvas if you're making bags. Canvas is just like a tighter weave. A lot of times it's cotton. It's just a different name, a different name for the weave of the cotton.
Yep.
So yeah, just sticking to some of the basics to start out.
Absolutely. And I just want to point out one thing you mentioned, which is perfect because you said information on the bolt, which is why I think, if you're just going, like the signs are going to say cotton or fleece, what I mean, the big signs on the aisles, but you need to look at the bolt of fabric for the actual information on the fabric. Don't just go off of, whatever little sign is on the aisle somewhere. Definitely look at the bolt. Yeah. All right, our next one here. Where do you think prices will top out on quality cotton for quilting? We're at $13 a yard for good cotton. Can you predict?
That's good, very good question. I have no idea and I can't predict it. And I think a lot of it also depends on, depends on demand. It depends on the designer, because if it's, a recognizable name who's designing it, you can, they'll charge more for that. Um, or if there's something special about it, some special dye or print or whatever, they're going to charge more for that, either because it actually costs more to make or just because they think they can get that much for it. So yeah, I don't know.
It's hard, and I think right now is a hard time too because yes, it's quilting cotton, and yes, you're looking at it maybe in terms of quilts, but it is being used so very much right now for making masks. 100% cotton is. So I think we talked about demand. That's definitely affecting the demand for fabric too. So not that that's going to go away anytime soon, but I think it will eventually sort of level out a little bit. But yeah, there's kind of a lot of things going into what you can use cotton for right now too. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, our next question here, Georgina asks, how to attach patches to hide a rip on leggings, like Lululemon leggings.
So to attach a patch onto like a knit, like leggings, it's trickier than attaching a patch onto, like, a woven fabric where you can just kind of slap it on and that that fabric isn't going to move around as much. So you can patch knit things, but you would want that patch to be able to stretch with the garment. And you would want to attach that patch on using a stitch that would also stretch. So you can use a zigzag stitch to, attach the edges of that patch around the rip. Um, just, on areas like a knee where it needs a lot of stretch, that's going to be kind of tricky. Um, because it's going to need to stretch in all directions. So you want the patch to be ideally a fabric that has the same amount of stretch as what you are patching. And you want to try to add enough stretch in your stitch to make sure that that will be able to stretch with your patch, and with your garment that you're patching, mending.
Yes.
So thinking about this for me, if I were to do this, I would probably want to hand stitch that, just because, you know, if it's leggings. Oh wait, did she say it was
Like
where it was?
leggings,
No,
yeah, leggings.
just a rip on leggings. Okay, so if it was like on the knee or somewhere where it would be hard for me to get on my sewing machine, I would probably hand stitch that, and then that would allow me to really um, just get, you know, get that stitch exactly where and how I wanted it to be. So the zigzag stitch would probably almost be almost even the satin stitch to get a lot of thread in there, and that way when you stretch it, that stitch can, you know, stretch out and give it a lot of elasticity and snap back. Um, so yeah, I that's kind of the process that I would use for that, but I would not really expect it to maybe last all that long, just because hatching a knit is tricky, just because of the amount of stretch that is in it, and that needs to be built into, you know, what you're adding onto it.
Absolutely. So we are about halfway through here. We still have a few more questions to get to, but I wanted to talk again about the download that I mentioned earlier, and it is either in the banner above or below the video you're watching now, and it's 6 ways to sharpen your tools. So Nicki, how do you normally sharpen your sewing tools, and or how often do you sharpen them?
So I will sharpen my rotary cutter when I go to cut something and it doesn't, you know, come off right away. There's like a thread or two that's still hanging on. So, you know, that all depends on how often I'm using my rotary cutter. The more you use it, the more it will dull faster. Same thing with my scissors. If I am not getting a good clip all the way to the end of my scissors, I'll I'll sharpen them up real quick at home. And we've talked about that before. How we do that is, you know, with our layers of tin foil that you can cut through or rotary cut through to give it a quick sharpen at home. But you know, sometimes my rotary cutter will get like a little ding in it or a nick if I accidentally, you know, try to cut through something that, if I, you know, roll up onto my ruler, which I sometimes do, or over a pin, heaven forbid, and get a real good nick in that rotary cutter blade, that might not be something that you can sharpen out, and that, you know, might be time for a new one. But you can maintain your blades at home for a good while pretty easily using that tinfoil trick. That's how I do it.
Yep. Same here. That's usually my go-to as well, but there are other ways that we provide information on as well in that guide. So I'm not going to tell you what they are, because you should go download the guide and you can find out what they are. But they're all, like you said, basic ways to, you're never going to get exactly back to 100% purchased quality, but it's definitely a way to, as you said, maintain so you don't have to replace things as often. So, all right. Our next question here. I'm a newbie to sewing, but would like to sew simple garments like skirts and dresses. With store-bought patterns, is it better to adjust the fit after you've put the garment together, before finishings and hemmings, or adjust the pattern before you cut the fabric?
So I'm a big proponent of altering the pattern first, but this can be hard for someone who is very new to sewing. You know, sometimes it can be hard to get familiar with the way a pattern goes together and how darts and seams and all those things can affect the fit. So maybe once you get more comfortable with it, you can start by going into the pattern first and, you know, measuring across the pattern and measuring that area of your body to alter, you know, the side seams or the darts to make sure when you cut out the fabric, you are, you know, that much closer to getting the perfect fit for you. But I recognize that, you know, if you're just starting out, it might be easier to visualize and to see if you have it cut out first, and then you know, you can put it actually on your body and see how it will fit, like when you're moving and everything. So to start out, that might be a good place to start. You can cut out the garment along the size lines that best reflect your measurements. And if you're doing a top or a dress that I would recommend cutting out the size line that most closely resembles your bust measurement, because that's a little bit more difficult to alter after the fact, and it's easier to alter waist on the side seams and along the side seams of the skirt if you're doing a dress. Um, so yeah, once you get the garment cut out, you can even just use a basting stitch to baste it together. And a basting stitch is just a longer stitch length. So I bump my stitch length up as high as it'll go, and I use that as my basting stitch. And that will hold the garment together enough for you to get it on and check the fit. But then if you need to, rip those seams out, it's easier to rip out a basting stitch than a shorter stitch length. So yeah, once you get your garment basted together, you can try it on. I recommend trying it on inside out, just so that you can see the seams, and then you can mark actually on the garment on your body using a fabric marker or pins to kind of mark if you need to take in anywhere, take up anywhere. And then you can either transfer those markings onto your pattern, or you can just make the adjustments to the garment. So you can even do alterations at both stages. You can alter the pattern a little bit. If you know you're going to need to let it out in a certain area, you can do that to the pattern and then check the fit on the garment after you've cut it out, and do a little bit more adjustment and alteration at that stage. If you are going to be making adjustments to the pattern after you've cut it out, if you have time, I like to, and if it's important enough to you, I would cut out the garment in a fabric that is similar to your final garment fabric, just in case of disasters, in case you need to let it out more than you expected. That way you haven't cut it out in your final fabric, and if you need to cut it out again, you don't have enough fabric. So doing it in a mock-up fabric can be a good idea, especially if you you don't have enough fabric to cut out another piece if you would need to. But again, that is an extra step that I not even I would take all the time. It's just if it was like, your wedding dress or something big that you really don't want to have to cut out again, and you want to get the fit exactly right. That's just like the stages, the steps that you would take for something like that, something big like that. But for a newbie sewing, I think it would be fine to just, cut out your garment and baste it, try it on, see how it would fit, see where you need to take out or, let out or take in, and then make those alterations after you've, basted it together. But yeah, definitely before the finishing and hemming stage, you want to make all those adjustments first, and then, do your final finishing seam allowances and hemming and all of that.
Yeah. I'm always about what's going to be quicker and easier. I mean, even on my wedding dress, I cut it just straight out of fashion fabric first, and I was like, I can take it in, later. But I will say, because you mentioned, if you don't have the mock-up fabric and you're going to cut it out of your fashion fabric, and you might have to take it in somewhere, let it out somewhere. You mentioned going off of your bust measurement, and the only thing I'm going to add is that depending on your body type, because I know you and I are very different. You are like a pencil, and I am not. So I always go off of the largest measurement, which for me is going to be like hip measurements, because I don't want to, like you mentioned, cut it out and then I can't let it out anymore because there isn't. So make sure you know what your widest part is, and cut that part out as needed.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a good tip. And I could see you like shaking your head as I was saying, like first do this and then do this. I could see you just smiling at me like,
I know, because and a lot of it comes from how you learn to sew. Like your background in sewing is much different than mine because you have sort of fashion design, pattern drafting, and you know how to do that versus me. I'm like, well, I know how to take a tuck. So I know it's going to be easier. So yeah, a lot of it's going to come back to that too. So there's so many different ways to approach things and just try and find what works for you. So perfect.
Yeah.
All right, our next one here. Seems like balloon sleeves are blowing up. What can be done to keep the balloon look? Is there a certain sewing technique?
So balloon sleeves, yes, balloon sleeve is just like a bigger type, puffier sleeve. Um, so if you want to add a balloon sleeve to your garment, that can be done at the pattern stage as well, of course. So you can even, you can Google balloon sleeve pattern and kind of see the shape. Um, but it'll just be, I think the pattern would, and I've never done this, so I'm just like, I'm pulling back to my pattern drafting classes in college. The pattern would, the side, the seam might be a little bit bowed, but you would have to, add fullness inside, the straight grain of the garment as well. So it'd be some slashing and spreading to get, a bigger sleeve, which would then also, I guess, depending on your preference, be either gathered in to the cuff and, to the sleeve cap, um, or, gathered maybe just a little bit or gathered tight. So, a lot of different options that you can play around with. I get very excited about pattern making and pattern alterations because the sky is the limit. You can do absolutely anything you want with fabric as long as the building blocks and the basics of pattern alteration. So I can't get super specific, gesturing with my hands and having not done a balloon sleeve in a really long time, but
Yeah.
that's maybe a general
How to? Yeah.
beginning point.
So this is gonna go. I'm gonna test your memory from like way back when we start. I know from way back when we started doing these live events. I feel like years ago now. And I remember you used to show a book that I think you might even still have it, and it was sort of the basics of building a sloper, the basics of pattern. Is that still? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, it's a blue hardcover textbook that I used in college and I would reference all the time. It's probably upstairs in my bookshelf in my sewing room. And I don't remember the exact title of it, but it's probably out of date now anyway. They probably have newer versions of it, but having a book on hand is so helpful simply because if you go online to look up a certain technique or something, you're going to get a lot of different sources and a lot of different ways of doing it, and you don't know if it's exactly a professional sometimes, maybe, if it's just somebody's blog. And a lot of sewing bloggers are super professional and know what they're doing, but some might not, and it can be hard to sift through and to choose what source to trust. So having a textbook or a book um, gives you kind of the peace of mind and simplifies it so that you don't have to sort through and figure out who knows what they're talking about, because that whoever wrote that book, they were vetted by a publisher, and it was edited for clarity and everything. So yeah, I do highly recommend having a book around for techniques like that you can reference and trust. But also, there are some websites out there that are fantastic. Like, let me make sure that this URL is right, but the Curvy Sewing Collective. is one that has great tutorials for pattern alterations, especially for plus size sewers. So it's curvysewingcollective.com. So that is one great resource that has awesome tutorials. And some other blogs that are awesome are mellysews.com. Her name is Melissa. She's got, her own indie patterns. And I reference her blog a lot for tutorials for myself to freshen up on. So if you have some websites that you know and trust, that are great resources, and of course, nationalsewingcircle.com. I mean, obviously,
I was going to say it
absolutely
if you weren't
reference.
going to. So.
What were you going to say?
I said I was going to say it if you weren't going to, So.
Oh yeah, I beat you to it.
No.
I stole your line. But yeah, if you're just starting out and you don't have those trusted sites to go to yet, a book to have on reference is a good place to start.
Absolutely. All right, next one here. Cheryl asks, can you go over a few sewing marking tools and which ones are more suitable based on the project?
Yes, Cheryl, thank you for asking. I think I did this in one video on National Sewing Circle. It was like intermediate sewing tips or something, but I love talking about it. So there are different marking tools out there, and some are definitely more suitable for some fabrics than others. So let's see what I have here. So there's the chalk pencil. So this is a good one for marking your stable weave fabrics like a quilting cotton, and they make these in different colors. So I've got white, I've got blue, I've got red, depending on what color fabric you're using, so that the mark will absolutely show up. And I'm not afraid to use this on the right side of the fabric because it will wash away if you're washing your project afterward. But if you're not, you can either take, so this has kind of like an eraser on the end. It's just like these little, like a basting brush almost, that you can rub it on and it'll rub the chalk away. Or you can just take some of the fabric and rub the fabric against the fabric, and that'll take the chalk mark away. You've got markers. So there's fabric markers. There are some that are air soluble that will just disappear after a while, and some that are water soluble that you blot with water or just throw in the wash and it'll disappear that way. But those scare me sometimes because if you are using it on a fiber content that just wants to soak up that ink and doesn't want to let it go, it just won't disappear. Like I had a white spandex fabric that I marked my purple air soluble marker on, and it took like weeks and weeks for that mark to fade, and even now I can still see it a little bit. So you can test markers on the wrong side in an inconspicuous area to see how it will disappear and come out, and if it will. But yeah, markers are good for fabrics that are like stretchy sometimes, because a chalk pencil, if you want to mark a knit with it, sometimes you have to press so hard with the chalk to get a line to come out that you like stretch the fabric and the line isn't straight. So markers are nice in that respect, but also make sure it will actually wash out or come out before you do it. This is my favorite marking tool. This is a chalk wheel. So all of the marking tools I've talked about so far are great for making marks on your fabric. We'll talk about transferring marks from a pattern in a minute, but this chalk wheel is awesome because it's got powdered chalk in here that you can refill, and it's got a wheel, a tiny little wheel at the tip, and you just, you run that little wheel along your fabric, and it lays a little bit of powdered chalk down. So you get a really fine line and you don't have to press hard. So this is my favorite for that. And I'm sure they make different colors of chalk powder as well for different colors of fabric. But if you are transferring marks from a pattern onto your fabric, you'll want to use tracing paper. So I used the same packet of tracing paper for like 12 years. I bought it in college and you can reuse the pages so many times. I finally just bought a new packet of this tracing paper, which was this Dritz wax-free tracing paper. So there are these pages and they come in all different colors. So blue, red, yellow, white, and I just touched it and you can see the chalk kind of comes off. So you can sandwich these between your layers of fabric. So if you want your mark to get on both layers of fabric, fold it so that, it's on both sides. Place it between your layers and you want to use your little tracing wheel. So with your pattern laid down on your fabric, use your tracing wheel to mark darts, points, notches, whatever you want to mark, and kind of pressing this down onto your fabric and onto the paper will transfer that chalk mark onto your fabric. So that's great for transferring marks. However, sometimes you don't want to use a wheel on your fabric. So if you're using a very delicate fabric, lightweight, you're not sure that the marks are going to come out, or you don't want to damage it with this wheel, like a velvet. You don't want to use this wheel on velvet because you'll crush the pile. Or if it's like a opaque chiffon or something really delicate that you don't want to put marks on or, possibly damage with your wheel, you can do tailor's tacks. So it's great for all kinds of different reasons. It's great for delicate fabrics. So a tailor's tack is easy. It's just you use a hand sewing needle and some high contrast thread, and you essentially just stitch through the pattern marking on your pattern and through your fabric layers. And you want to leave long thread tails so that you can, lift your fabric layers apart and cut in between so that you leave some of that thread in each layer of fabric. So you can do a long running stitch on darts, make an X stitch on, circles if you need to mark, for matching points, and just cut so that you leave enough thread so that you can see that mark when you take the layers apart. And then after you stitch it, you can just pull those threads out or cut them out if you need to. So that's a great option. Like I said, I usually use my chalk wheel, but for marking, if I can't use my paper, I will use tailor's tacks.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. I like it. The only thing while you were talking about your marking tools, I grabbed one that I just recently started using, mostly in terms of quilting related, but it kind of works the exact same way as your tracing wheel. It's just not a wheel, and it's called a Hera marker. So it's just kind of, it's like plastic, but it comes to a point, and same thing, you just run it right along your fabric and it kind of indents, not permanently, but it makes a mark. It's definitely to where if I were to do it and I'm sitting here, I can see it, but if I were to try and like hold it up and the camera might not catch it. So it's not like the best or most deepest mark, but it's definitely a good option too.
Cool.
All right, we have kind of a two-part here. We have a question, and then we have a couple comments that have come in with suggestions, and then we'll see what your suggestions are as well. But so they said they tried sewing a vest with faux fur, but got all of the hairs caught and bunched up, and they want to know if you have any recommendations. And a couple of the suggestions that were coming in from our viewers were to cut down some of the fur where you'll be sewing. They've had success with that, but what would be your tips?
Yeah, that's a great tip to kind of cut down the fur out of your seam allowances so that when you stitch right at your seam allowance, you will have, cut all the fur away from inside the seam allowance. and stitch right at the edge there so that where your seam joins, you've got fur right up to the seam, but not, inside the seam. And that helps to take away a lot of the bulk too of faux fur. Another thing that you can do is if you stitch and you do get some of that fur caught in your seam, you can take a brush or a comb and just kind of comb it out. And a lot of times that fur will just kind of, come right out of your being caught in your seam. So you can try combing that out. But yeah, trimming that hair, even just if you trim it down a little bit out of your seam allowance, that can really help with getting that caught and bunched up and getting all of that bulk. So that's actually the number one tip that I would have suggested too.
Yeah, absolutely. To say we have a video on National Sewing Circle for working with tricky or other fabrics like that, and you do one on faux fur, and I brushed it before I stitched it. So like I have my two pieces, and if your fur is going down, like brush it perpendicular to the way that your fur is going, then go ahead and sew it, and that way once you have stitched your seam, then you can sort of brush it back and the seam literally disappears. And so if you feel like there's excess, then you can always maybe go in and trim a little bit there, but that way you can totally cover up the seam. And then when you flip it over and you have your seam allowances and you can see the fur on the inside, that's when I would trim it away, because I'm always afraid I'm going to trim away too much first and then I'm going to have this gap. So I would brush it, sew it, cover it back up, then flip it over, and when you have the fur on the seam allowance side, those in the cosmetic aisles, it's actually for like trimming your eyebrows, but it's like a little tiny straight razor on a handle. I would come in with that, right? And I would trim it and shave it with that. So that's would be way easier than scissors, right? And you can just go right along and maybe even in a couple of little motions. I feel like that sounds like I'm working with like a deer hide or something, but like that's how I would, yeah, exactly, get those extra little furry
Yeah.
fluffs away. So yeah.
That
So
makes sense.
yeah, and see, we're always talking about tools outside of the sewing room, coming into the sewing room. That cosmetics aisle, I tell you, is a good one to go down. All right, our next one here, Marlene asks, I have two pairs of stretch denim jeans that need to be hemmed. How do I go about hemming by machine without having them pucker at the bottom?
So to hem stretch denim jeans, I would say as long as you are not stretching them as you're sewing them, they shouldn't gather up or pucker at all. I would make sure to use a all-purpose or polyester thread, because if that hem at the bottom is going to have to stretch over your foot or over your heel, you want to make sure you add some stretch into that seam. So if you're just hemming it like a double fold hem, something like that, I would say to use a stretch stitch. So use either a triple stretch stitch if you want that straight stitch look. So a triple stretch stitch is 2 stitches forward and 1 stitch back. So it adds a little bit of stretch into that stitch so that if you stretch that seam, it's not going to pop. You get a little bit of give to it. Or if you don't mind the look of a zigzag stitch on your hem, that of course adds a lot of stretch into your seam. And I mentioned the all-purpose or polyester thread simply because that thread has a little bit of extra give to it as well, instead of 100% cotton thread, which will snap when stretched at all. The all-purpose or polyester thread just has that little bit of extra wiggle room, like a safety net. If you stretch to the end of the stretch of your seam, that thread will give you just a little bit more. So yeah, I would say those tips, just make sure you're not stretching the fabric as you sew it. Make sure it's laying flat. That should work just fine.
Yep, absolutely. All right, we have time for one last question here. How do you store patterns that you've downloaded? All that paper is just so bulky.
It is. And I have not perfected my storage process either. That's a work in progress. But when I print patterns off and you lay them all out and you tape them all together and then cut it out, I try to make sure that I tape before I roll it up to store it. I tape all of all of the edges of the seam, or, at least in, a lot of areas, so that if I've got 2 pages taped together, normally when I'm putting it together, I tape at each corner and that's it. But to roll it up and store it, you don't want those pages, coming apart in the middle. So I'll put another couple pieces of tape just to keep it together. And then I roll it up. I don't like creasing my patterns just because it's kind of a bummer to then try to lay it out flat again. So I will roll them up and rubber band them, and I have like a tote of scrolls, like I'm some old time librarian in the corner of my room, of just like patterns that are standing upright in a tote. And I write on the outside of them what they are, and where I downloaded them from, so that I can see at a glance what they are, and what they are without having to unroll them. So that is my system. I know a lot of people, at least for commercial patterns, have said that they store everything like in a Ziploc bag. Like if they can't fold up their pattern to get it back in the envelope nicely, they'll put it in a Ziploc bag and then poke a hole in the top and hang it on a hanger, which is a nice way to keep things organized and not like in a drawer where things get buried at the bottom. So that's another option that might work too. But it's different for everyone too, because everyone's storage space and space limitations are different. But you could try one of those things.
I like the rolling it. I rolled a couple, but I didn't even think about putting them upright in a tote. And I always roll them, put rubber bands on them, and they end up on a shelf. And that roll turns into like a squish. So I just just thought about you can get those poster storage tubes, and you
Right.
can actually, those are just cardboard tubes. You can get them in a bunch of different sizes. You can put your patterns down in there and then feel like you're in like you said, an old time museum or something with all of your. I like it. I think I'm going to do that. It's going to be my new system. I like it. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here to answer all of our sewing questions. And of course, I want to remind everyone again to download that guide on how 6 ways to sharpen your tools, not just your rotary cutters, which you mentioned, but also your scissors, things like pins and needles even. So lots of good tips in that. So be sure to download that. And then, of course, join us back here next month for another Q&A with Nicki.